Section 15 of Germany Before the War by Baron Eugene Napoleon Beyens, translated by Paul V. Cohn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Lienhart. Chapter 8, The Week of Tragedy, Part 2, Segment 6. The game of German diplomacy during these first days of the crisis, 24th to 28th July, has already been revealed. At first inclined to bludgeon, it soon came to take things easily, even affecting a certain optimism, and by its passive resistance bringing to naught all the efforts and all the proposals of the London, Paris, and St. Petersburg cabinets. To gain time, to lengthen out negotiations, seems to have been the task imposed upon Austria-Hungary's accomplice in order to promote rapid action by the dual monarchy, and to face the Triple Entente with irrevocable deeds, namely the occupation of Belgrade and the surrender of the Serbians. But things did not go as Berlin and Vienna had hoped, and the determined front shown by Russia, who in answer to the partial mobilization of Austria mobilized her army in 4 southern districts, gave food for reflection to the tacticians of the Wilhelmstrasse. Their language and their frame of mind grew gentler to a singular degree on the 5th day, 28th July. It may be recalled in passing that in 1913, during the Balkan hostilities, Austria and Russia had likewise proceeded to partial mobilizations, yet these steps had not made them come to blows or even brought them to the verge of hostilities. On the evening of the 26th, the Emperor's return was announced in Berlin. Why did he come back so suddenly? I think I am justified in saying that, at this news, the general feeling among the actors and spectators of the drama was one of grave anxiety. Our hearts were heavy within us. We had a foreboding that the decisive moment was drawing near. It was the same at the Wilhelmstrasse. To the British chargé d'affaires, Herr von Zimmermann frankly confessed his regret at this move, on which William II had decided without consulting anyone. Nevertheless, our fears at first seemed to be unwarranted. The 28th was marked by a notable loosening of Germany's stiff-necked attitude. The British ambassador, who had returned to Berlin on the previous day, was summoned in the evening by the Chancellor. Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg, while rejecting the conference proposed by Sir Edward Grey, promised to use his good offices to induce Russia and Austria to discuss the position in an amicable fashion. "A war between the great powers must be averted," were his closing words. It is highly probable that the Chancellor at that time sincerely wanted to keep the peace, and that his first efforts, when he saw the danger coming nearer and nearer, succeeded in curbing the Emperor's impatience for 48 hours. The telegram sent by William II to the Tsar on the evening of the 28th is friendly, almost reassuring. Quote, "Bearing in mind the cordial friendship that has united us too closely for a long time past, I am using all my influence to make Austria arrive at a genuine and satisfactory understanding with Russia." End quote. How are we to explain, then, the abrupt change of tack that occurred the following day at Berlin, or rather at Potsdam, and the peculiar language addressed by the Chancellor to Sir Edward Goschen on the evening of the 29th? In that nocturnal scene, there was no longer any question of Austria's demands on Serbia, or even of the possibility of an Austro-Russian war. The center of gravity was suddenly shifted, and at a single stride, the danger passed from the southeast of Europe to the northwest. What is it that Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg wants to know at once, as he comes straight from a council held at Potsdam under the presidency of the Emperor? Whether Great Britain would consent to remain neutral in a European war, provided that Germany agreed to respect the territorial integrity of France. "And what of the French colonies?" asked the ambassador, with great presence of mind. The Chancellor can make no promise on this point, but he unhesitatingly declares that Germany will respect the integrity and neutrality of Holland. As for Belgium, France's action will determine what operations Germany may be forced to enter upon in that country, but when the war is over, Belgium will lose no territory unless she ranges herself on the side of Germany's foes. Such was the shameful bargain proposed to England at a time when none of the negotiators had dared to speak in plain terms of a European war, or even to offer a glimpse of that terrifying vision. This interview was the immediate result of the decisive step taken by German diplomacy on the same day at St. Petersburg. The step in question has been made known to us through the diplomatic documents which have been printed by the orders of the belligerent governments, and all of which concur in their account of this painful episode. Twice on that day did Monsieur Sazonov receive a visit from the German ambassador, who came to make a demand wrapped up in threats. Count de Portales insisted on Russia contenting herself with a promise, guaranteed by Germany, that Austria-Hungary would not impair the integrity of Serbia. Monsieur Sazonov refused to countenance the war on this condition. Serbia, he felt, would become a vassal of Austria, and a revolution would break out in Russia. Count de Portales then backed his request with a warning that, unless Russia desisted from her military preparations, Germany would mobilize. A German mobilization, he said, would mean war. The results of the second interview, which took place at 2 o'clock in the morning, were as negative as those of the first, notwithstanding a last effort, a final suggestion by Monsieur Sazonov to stave off the crisis. His giving in to Germany's brutal dictation would have been an avowal that Russia was impotent. To the Emperor William, who had resumed the conduct of affairs since the morning of the 27th, the Emperor William, itching to cut the knot, driven on by his staff and his generals, to him and no other must we trace the responsibility for this insolent move, which made war inevitable. Quote, "The heads of the army insisted," end quote, was all that Herr von Jagow would vouchsafe a little later to Monsieur Cambon by way of explanation. The Chancellor, and with him the Foreign Secretary and Undersecretary, associated themselves with these hazardous tactics from sheer inability to secure the adoption of less hasty and violent methods. If they believed that this summary breaking off of negotiations would meet with success, they were as grievously mistaken as Count de Portales, whose reports utterly misled them as to the sacrifices that Russia was prepared to make for Serbia. At all events, this upright man, when he realized the appalling effects of his blunder, gave free play to his emotion. Such sensitiveness is rare indeed in a German and redounds entirely to his credit. But the Emperor and his council of generals, what was their state of soul at this critical moment? Perhaps this riddle will never be wholly solved. From the military point of view, which in their eyes claimed first attention, they must have rejoiced at Monsieur Sazonov's answer, for never again would they find such a golden opportunity for vanquishing Russia and making an end of her rivalry. In 1917, the reorganization of her army would have been complete. Her artillery would have been at full strength, and a new network of strategic railways would have enabled her to let loose upon the two Germanic empires a vast flood of fighting men drawn from the inexhaustible reservoir of her population. The struggle with the Colossus of the North, despite the vaunted technical superiority of the German army, would in all likelihood have ended in the triumph of overwhelming might. In the France of 1917, again, the 3 years' term of service would have begun to produce its full results, and her first-line troops would have been both more numerous and better trained than at present. On the other hand, William II could cherish no false hopes as to the consequences of this second pressure that he was bringing to bear on St. Petersburg. Had it succeeded in 1914 as in 1909, the encounter between Germany and the great Slav Empire would only have been put off to a later day, instead of being finally shelved. How could the Tsar or the Russian people have forgiven the Kaiser for humbling them once more? If they had pocketed the affront in silence, it would only have been in order to bide their time for revenge, and they would have chosen the moment when Russia, in possession of all her resources, could have entered upon the struggle with every chance of winning. Here an objection may be raised. The German emperor, some may hold, fancying that the weight of his sword in the scale would induce the Tsar to shrink from action, had foreseen the anger of the Slav nation at its sovereign's timorous scruples, and looked forward to revolutionary outbreaks which would cripple the government for years to come and make it unable to think of war, if indeed they did not sweep the Romanovs from the throne. I would answer that this Machiavellian scheme could never have entered the head of such a ruler as William II, with his deep sense of monarchical solidarity, and his instinctive horror of anarchist outrages and of revolution. No, the emperor, together with the military authorities whose advice he took, wished to profit by a juncture which he had awaited with longing, and which fickle fortune might never again offer to his ambition. Everything proves it, down to his feverish haste, as soon as Monsieur Sazonoff's reply was conveyed to him, to learn the intentions of England, and to suggest on that very day a bargain that might purchase her neutrality. This is why Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg received orders to summon the British ambassador on the night of the 29th. The emperor could not wait until the following morning, so eager was he to act. Is this impatience the mark of one who is the victim of a concerted surprise? If he had not wanted war, would he not have tried to resume negotiations with Russia on a basis more in keeping with her dignity as a great power, however heavy a blow it was to his own pride that he had failed to intimidate her? Segment 7. The abortive efforts to overawe St. Petersburg and the offers made to the British ambassador, as if Great Britain's inaction could be sold to the highest bidder, brought results that were not hard to foresee. In London, Sir Edward Grey's indignation found immediate vent in the following passage of his telegram of 30th July to Sir Edward Goschen. Quote, "It would be a disgrace for us to make this bargain with Germany at the expense of France, a disgrace from which the good name of this country would never recover. The Chancellor also, in effect, asks us to bargain away whatever obligation or interest we have as regards the neutrality of Belgium. We could not entertain that bargain either." End quote. Through the brazen overtures of Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg, however, the British cabinet henceforth came to occupy itself, before all things, with the fate allotted to our country by the imperial government in the war that it was preparing. In order to tear off the mask from German statesmanship, the surest method was to ask it a straightforward question. On 31st July, Sir Edward Grey, following the example of the Gladstone Ministry of 1870, inquired both of Germany and France whether they would respect the neutrality of Belgium. At the same time, he gave Belgium to understand that Britain counted on her doing her utmost to maintain her neutrality. The answer of the Republican government was frank and unhesitating. It was resolved to respect Belgian neutrality, and would only act otherwise if the violation of that neutrality by some other power forced it to do so in self-defense. The Belgian government, for its part, hastened to assure the British minister at Brussels of its determination to resist with might and main should its territory be invaded. At Berlin, however, the Foreign Secretary eluded Sir Edward Goshen's questions. He said that he must consult the Emperor and the Chancellor. In his opinion, any answer would entail the risk, in the event of war, of partly divulging the plan of campaign. It seemed doubtful to him, therefore, whether he would be able to give a reply. This way of speaking was perfectly clear in its ambiguity. It did not puzzle Sir Edward Grey for a moment. On the following day, he declared to the German ambassador that the reply of the German government was a matter of very great regret. Belgian neutrality, he pointed out, was highly important in British eyes, and if Belgium was attacked, it would be difficult to restrain public feeling in his country. On the same day, the 1st of August, in accordance with instructions from my government, I read to the Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, at the same time giving him a copy, a dispatch drafted beforehand and addressed to the Belgian ministers attached to the powers that had guaranteed our neutrality. This dispatch affirmed that Belgium, having observed with scrupulous fidelity the duties imposed on her as a neutral state by the treaties of 19th April 1839, would manifest an unshaken purpose in fulfilling them, and that she had every hope, since the friendly intentions of the powers towards her had been so often professed, of seeing her territory secure from all assault if hostilities should arise near her frontiers. The Belgian government added that it had nevertheless taken all the necessary steps for maintaining its neutrality, but that, in so doing, it had not been actuated by a desire to take part in an armed struggle among the powers, or by a feeling of distrust towards any one of them. Herr Zimmermann listened without a word of comment to my reading of this dispatch, which expressed the loyal confidence of my government in Germany's goodwill. He merely took note of my communication. His silence did not surprise me, for I had just learnt of Herr von Jago's evasive reply to the British government concerning Belgium, but it bore out all my misgivings. His constrained smile, by the way, told me quite as much as his refusal to speak. From the 30th, Russia and Germany, as an inevitable sequel to the conversations of the 29th, went forward actively with their military preparations. What was the exact nature of these preludes to the German mobilization? It was impossible to gain any precise notion at Berlin. The capital was rife with various rumors that augured ill for the future. We heard tell of regiments moving from the northern provinces towards the Rhine. We learnt that reservists had been instructed to keep themselves in readiness for marching orders. At the same time, postal communication with Belgium and France had been cut off. At the Wilhelmstrasse, the position was described to me as follows, quote, Austria will reply to Russia's partial mobilization with a general mobilization of her army. It is to be feared that Russia will then mobilize her entire forces, which will compel Germany to do the same, end quote. As it turned out, a general mobilization was indeed proclaimed in Austria on the night of the 30th. Nevertheless, the peace pourparlers went on between Vienna and St. Petersburg on the 30th and 31st, although on the latter date Russia, as Berlin expected, in answer both to the Austrian and the German preparations, had mobilized her entire forces. Even on the 31st, these discussions seemed to have some chance of attaining their object. Austria was now more accurately gauging the peril into which her own blind self-confidence and the counsels of her ally were leading her, and was pausing on the brink of the abyss. The Vienna cabinet even consented to talk over the gist of its note to Serbia, and Monsieur Sazonov at once sent an encouraging reply. It was desirable, he stated, that representatives of all the great powers should confer in London under the direction of the British government. Was a faint glimmer of peace, after all, dawning above the horizon? Would an understanding be reached at the 11th hour among the only states really concerned with the Serbian question? We had reckoned without our host. The German emperor willed otherwise. Suddenly, at the instance of the General Staff, and after a meeting of the Federal Council, as prescribed by the Constitution, he issued the decree of Kriegsfahrzustand, imminence of war. This is the first phase of a general mobilization, a sort of martial law substituting the military for the civil authorities as regards the public services, means of communication, post, telegraphs, and telephones. This momentous decision was revealed to us on the 31st by a special edition of the Berliner Lokalanzeiger, distributed at every street corner. The announcement ran as follows, quote, Russia wants war. From official sources, we have just received at 2 p.m. the following report, pregnant with consequences. The German ambassador at St. Petersburg sends us word today that a general mobilization of the Russian army and navy had previously been ordered. That is why His Majesty the Emperor William has decreed an imminence of war. His Majesty will take up his residence in Berlin today. Imminence of war is the immediate prelude to a general mobilization in answer to the menace that already hangs over Germany today, owing to the step taken by the Tsar. End quote. As a drowning man catches at a straw, those who in Berlin saw themselves with horror faced by an impending catastrophe clutched at a final hope. The German general mobilization had not yet been ordered. Who knew whether at the last moment some happy inspiration from the British cabinet, that most stalwart champion of peace, might cause the weapons to drop from the hands that were about to wield them. Once more, however, the emperor, by his swift moves, shattered this fond illusion. On the 31st, at 7 o'clock in the evening, he dispatched to the Russian government a summons to demobilize both on its Austrian and on its German frontiers. An interval of 12 hours was given for a reply. It was obvious that Russia, who had refused 2 days before to cease from her military preparations, would not accept the German ultimatum, worded as it was in so dictatorial a form, and rendered still more insulting by the briefness of the interval granted. As, however, no answer had come from St. Petersburg by the afternoon of 1st August, Herren von Jagow and Zimmermann, so the latter informed me, rushed to the Chancellor and the Emperor in order to request that the decree for a general mobilization might at least be held over until the following day. They supported their plea by urging that the telegraphic communication with St. Petersburg had presumably been cut, and that this would explain the silence of the Tsar. Perhaps they still hoped against hope for a conciliatory proposal from Russia. This was the last flicker of their dying pacifism, or the last awakening of their conscience. Their efforts could make no headway against the stubborn opposition of the war minister and the army chiefs, who represented to the emperor the dangers of a 24 hours delay. The order for a mobilization of the army and navy was signed at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was at once given out to the public by a special edition of the Lokalanzeiger. The mobilization was to begin on 2nd August. On the 1st, at 10 minutes past 7 in the evening, Germany's declaration of war was forwarded to Russia. As all the world knows, the Berlin cabinet had to resort to wild pretexts, such as the committing of acts of hostility, so the military authorities alleged, by French aviators on imperial soil, in order to find motives 2 days later for its declaration of war on France. Although Germany tried to lay the blame for the catastrophe at Russia's door, it was in reality her western neighbor that she wished to attack and annihilate first. On this point, there can be no possible doubt today. Poor France, said the Berlin newspapers with feigned compassion. They acknowledged that the conduct of the French government throughout the crisis had been irreproachable, and that it had worked without respite for the maintenance of peace. While her leaders fulfilled this noble duty to mankind, France was offering the world an impressive sight, the sight of a nation looking calmly and without fear at a growing peril that she had done nothing to conjure up, and regarding her word as her bond, determined in cold blood to follow the destiny of her ally on the field of battle. At the same time, she offered to Germany, who had foolishly counted on her being torn by internal troubles and political feuds, the vision of her children closely linked together in an unconquerable resolve, the resolve to beat back an iniquitous assault upon their country. Nor was this the only surprise that she held in store. With the stone wall of her resistance, she was soon to change the whole character of the struggle and to wreck the calculations of German strategy. No one had labored with more energy and skill to quench the flames lit by Austria and her ally than the representative of the Republic at Berlin. "Don't you think Monsieur Cambon's attitude has been admirable?" remarked the British ambassador to me in the train that was whirling us far away from the German capital on 6 August. Quote, "Throughout these terrible days, nothing has been able to affect his coolness, his presence of mind, and his insight." End quote. I cannot express my own admiration better than by repeating this verdict of so capable a diplomat as Sir Edward Goschen, who himself took a most active part in the vain attempt of the Triple Entente to save Europe from calamity. Segment 8. The Berlin population had followed the various phases of the crisis with tremendous interest, but with no outward show of patriotic fervor. Those fine summer days passed as tranquilly as usual. Only in the evenings did some hundreds of youths march along the highways of the central districts, soberly singing national anthems and dispersing after a few cries of Hoch outside the Austro-Hungarian and Italian embassies and the Chancellor's mansion. On the 2nd of August, I watched the animation of the Sunday crowd that thronged the broad avenue of the Kurfürstendamm. It read attentively the special editions of the newspapers, and then each went off to enjoy his or her favorite pastime, games of tennis for the young men and maidens, long bouts of drinking in the beer gardens for the more sedate citizens with their families. When the imperial motor car flashed like a streak of lightning down Unter den Linden, it was hailed with loud but by no means frantic cheers. It needed the outcries of the press against Russia as the instigator of the war, the misleading speeches of the emperor and the chancellor, and the wily publications of the government to kindle a patriotism rather slow to take fire. Towards the close of my stay, feeling displayed itself chiefly by jeers at the unfortunate Russians who were returning post-haste to their native country. and blackguard behavior towards the staff of the Tsar's ambassador as he was leaving Berlin. That the mass of the German people, unaware of Russia's peaceful intentions, should have been easily deluded is no matter for astonishment. The upper classes, however, those of more enlightened intellect, cannot have been duped by the official falsehoods. They knew as well as we do that it was greatly to the advantage of the Tsar's government not to provoke a conflict. In fact, this question is hardly worth discussing. Once more, we must repeat that in the plans of William II and his generals, the Serbian affair was a snare spread for the Northern Empire before the growth of its military powers should have made it an invincible foe. There is no gainsaying that uncertainty as to Britain's intervention was one of the factors that encouraged Germany. We often asked ourselves anxiously at Berlin whether Germany's hand would not have been stayed altogether if the British government had formally declared that it would not hold aloof from the war. We even hoped, for a brief moment, that Sir Edward Grey would destroy the illusions on which the German people loved to batten. The British Foreign Secretary did indeed observe to Prince Lichnowsky on 29th July that the Austro-Serbian issue might become so great as to involve all European interests, and that he did not wish the ambassador to be misled by the friendly tone of their conversations into thinking that Britain would stand aside. If at the beginning she had openly taken her stand by the side of her allies, she might, to be sure, have checked the fatal march of events. This, at any rate, is the most widespread view, for a maritime war certainly did not enter into the calculations of the Emperor and Admiral von Tirpitz, while it was the nightmare of the German commercial world. In my opinion, however, an outspoken threat from England on the 29th, a sudden roar of the British Lion, would not have made William II draw back. The memory of Agadir still rankled in the proud Germanic soul. The emperor would have risked losing all prestige in the eyes of a certain element among his subjects if at the bidding of the Anglo-Saxon he had refused to go further and had thus played into the hands of those who charged him with conducting a policy of mere bluff and intimidation. "Germany barks, but does not bite," was a current saying abroad, and this naturally tended to exasperate her. An ominous warning from the lips of Sir Edward Grey would only have served to precipitate the onslaught of the Kaiser's armies in order that the intervention of the British fleet might have no influence on the result of the campaign, the rapid and decisive campaign planned at Berlin. We know, moreover, from the telegrams and speeches of the British foreign minister, how carefully he had to reckon with public feeling among his countrymen in general and among the majority in Parliament. A war in the Balkans did not concern the British nation, and the strife between Teuton and Slav left it cold. It did not begin to be properly roused until it grasped the reality of the danger to France's very existence, and it did not respond warmly to the eloquent appeals of Mr. Asquith and Sir Edward Grey until the day when it knew that the Germans were at the gates of Liège, where they threatened both Paris and Antwerp, that pistol pointed at the heart of England. Looking at the matter from a purely moral point of view, we must recognize that the majority of the British have a deeply religious spirit, but a Christian ideal that is utterly at variance with the warlike pietism of the Kaiser and his subjects. Their unsophisticated ideas and their Puritan principles lead them to condemn all statecraft that lets loose the scourge of war. Their reluctance to take part in a continental war was only overcome through the dastardly attack of Germany upon a little free people, too weak to parry the blow. Then followed an irresistible impulse to punish and avenge when news was brought of the atrocities committed by the German soldiery in Belgium. It is this nation, dowered with a true moral greatness, that enemy speakers and pamphleteers accuse today of having formed the coalition that bars the way to their ambitious schemes. It is England that they denounce as having woven a web of intrigue to enmesh their country. They know the British nation no better than Treitschke and his followers knew it, when they proclaimed that it was a mere rabble of shopkeepers, greedy of pelf and destitute of warrior virtues. They misjudged it as hopelessly as Herr von Bethmann Hollweg, who was indignant at its setting so much store by an antiquated treaty. The events leading up to the present war have revealed to us the honesty and scrupulousness of British diplomacy, side by side with the bad faith of German diplomacy, and they have thrown ample light upon the loyalty of Great Britain and her ministers, as contrasted with the double dealing of Germany and her imperial functionaries. End of section 15. Section 16 of Germany Before the War by Baron-Eugène Napoleon-Beyens, translated by Paul V. Cohn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Chapter 9, Belgian Neutrality and the Invasion of Belgium, Part 1, Segment 1. The violation of Belgian neutrality has brought forth a luxuriant crop of books, pamphlets, and articles in newspapers and reviews. Some indignantly denounce, others impudently defend the action of the German government. The commentaries published on the treaties of 19th April 1839 have taught many Belgians who were ill-informed on the point what the permanent neutrality of their country really means. It was not a heaven-sent blessing graciously poured out on the new state that had built itself up after the rising of the Flemish and Walloon provinces against the House of Orange. In recognizing it as an independent kingdom and granting it the privilege of permanent neutrality, the five powers who at that time laid down the law to Europe invested it with a special character, as if it had been a creation of their diplomacy. The neutrality of Belgium was indeed to shield her from the grasping designs of her neighbors, but it was also destined to serve the interests of the great powers by helping to maintain the balance of Europe. Thus, the treaties of 1839 repaired the injury that had been done to the work of the Congress of Vienna, when that artificial fabric, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, was destroyed through Belgian efforts. The assurance that we should enjoy the blessings of peace for an indefinite period carried with it no small obligations towards the guarantors of our neutrality. We could not let ourselves be induced to favor any one of them in particular, either through personal bias or through political considerations. The Belgian signatories to the Pacts of 1839 fully realized the duties incumbent upon a perpetually neutral state, and their adhesion made it certain that their successors would always fulfill these duties. All Belgians are convinced that none of their ministers since then has failed to keep the engagements to which his loyal predecessors set their hand. More than 25 years ago, King Leopold, on the strength of some documents produced by two forgers, Mondion and Nieder, was repeatedly accused by sundry Parisian publicists, whose words carried a certain weight, of having entered into a secret convention with Germany against France. How little these writers knew of our king and of his real sentiments towards our disconcerting eastern neighbors. Few rulers had a clearer insight than he into the ambitions that they had not yet laid bare. With his marvelous knowledge of men, he had read, as in open book, the erratic and overbearing character of William II. On one of the last occasions that he honored me with his advice, he warned me to beware, when I went to Germany, of German civilities. As soon as the second king of the Belgians began once more, after a long interval, to visit Paris, the Parisians learnt to know him better, and the charges against his political good faith died down like an untended fire. Was it impracticable for a Belgian sovereign to conclude a secret military convention? We learnt at the beginning of the present war that such a treaty existed between the King of Romania and the Emperor of Austria, a treaty directed against Russia and approved, whenever the time came for its renewal, by the Romanian Prime Minister, whether liberal or conservative. When I was acting as representative of the Belgian government at Bucharest, the existence of this pact was strenuously confirmed or as strenuously denied by several of my colleagues. The Russian minister, Monsieur de Fontaine, refused to believe in it. This was the only point on which he disagreed with his friend and ally, Monsieur Arsène Henry, the French envoy. The convention was none the less real for all that, although it did not survive the ordeal of being dragged out from its hiding place. In signing this futile agreement, King Carol had not overstepped his constitutional rights, as was proved by the countersignature of the responsible minister. If such freedom of action was allowed to Romania, why was it denied to Belgium? The answer is not far to seek. Romania is not, like Belgium, a neutral state. King Carol could pick and choose his secret allies according to his political plans or his hereditary instincts. A king of the Belgians cannot. The diplomatic instruments sanctioned by our rulers have always been drawn up in the full light of day. Supposing, although the supposition is an insult to his memory, King Leopold had not wished to observe the 1839 treaties, or King Albert, who is the soul of honor, had been guilty of the same base intention. Neither would have found a minister to countersign a secret convention with France, England, or Germany. It is formally laid down by Article 64 of our Constitution that without the signature of a responsible minister, no royal document can be valid. A treaty furnished merely with a royal seal would have been, in Herr von Bateman-Holweg's immortal phrase, nothing more than a scrap of paper. An underhand compact, when our government takes counsel, debates, and acts in broad daylight, under the alert control of the parliamentary opposition and of public opinion. A military convention, framed for the defense of the country, not transgressing, indeed, according to the doctrine in vogue, the rights of a neutralized state, but wholly running counter to our deep-rooted belief in the sovereign virtue of our neutrality. A hidden pledge out of all keeping with the friendly and trustful spirit that guided our relations with each of the guaranteeing powers. I feel certain that not one of the statesmen who had the honor of succeeding Frere Aubin, Malou, Bernert, our great ministers of the past, would have consented to sign such a covenant. Segment 2. On two separate occasions during the last 2 years, British military attachés at Brussels have spontaneously approached Belgian officers of the higher ranks with a view to learning whether we had considered, in the event of a European war, the possibility of an attempt by an advancing German army to force its way through Belgium, and whether our means of resistance were adequate. In 1906, Lieutenant Colonel Barnardiston had several interviews with General Ducarne, our Chief of Staff, on the subject of cooperation by British troops in the defense of our territory. This was soon after the first alarm caused by Germany's browbeating policy over the Moroccan question. The Belgian general had no reason for refusing to enter into these conversations. They were private, strictly confidential, and of great interest from a military point of view, but he had not received a mandate to pursue them in the name of the royal government. After they had ended, he wrote out a report and handed it in to his chief, the war minister. The report contains in the margin a note of cardinal importance, purposely omitted by the German authorities in the text of the document when they issued a translation last autumn. Quote, "The entry of the British into Belgium would take place only after a violation of our neutrality by Germany." End quote. The Belgian government was greatly astonished at the initiative taken by the British military attaché. It had, however, no power to prevent a foreign officer from expressing his personal views as to the hostile aims of a neighboring nation whose relations with Belgium were at that time friendly. Still relying on the pledges given in 1839 by the powers, among them Prussia, which today means Germany, the offspring of the Prussian state and heir to its obligations, it determined not to act upon the confidential statements of Lieutenant Colonel Barnardiston. The latter had simply communicated the ideas of the British staff. His conversations, as he himself realized, could not be deemed binding upon his government. It will be noticed, by the way, that even at that date, the British officers had a very clear conception of Germany's schemes. The invasion of Belgium was an act of war foreseen in London 10 years before the event. Some years later, in April 1912, another British military attaché in Brussels, Lieutenant Colonel Bridges, had an interview on the same topic with General Jungbluth, who was then chief of our staff. This step would prove, if proof were needed, that no secret engagement previously existed between Britain and our country. The Englishman, in the course of his informal chat, remarked that during the crisis of 1911, his government would have landed troops in Belgium even if their aid had not been invoked. This is perfectly in accordance with international law, by virtue of which the guaranteeing state, if it considers intervention to be necessary, must intervene of its own accord, even in the teeth of opposition from the neutral state concerned. This claim, however, was forthwith countered by General Jungbluth with the view that has always been upheld by the Belgian authorities, that the preliminary consent of Belgium is essential. Lieutenant Colonel Bridges did not press the point, and there the matter rested. The Belgian government, to whom the Chief of Staff sent a report, did not enjoin him to proceed with the conversations. In 1912, as in 1906, no convention was framed between Belgium and Great Britain, nor between Belgium and France, who had not offered us military support for the defense of our neutrality. On the other hand, there was no need for the Belgian government to inform the Berlin cabinet of these private interviews. Our two neighbors had quite enough grounds already for picking a quarrel. We preferred not to throw into their midst a fresh element of distrust, a new apple of discord in the shape of these utterances by foreign military attachés, no doubt very anxious to do their duty. I will add, in passing, a detail that has not yet been made known to the world. In that same year, 1912, General Jungbluth was invited to attend the British Army maneuvers, at which, owing to seniority, he would have taken precedence of all the other foreign officers. He thought proper to decline this invitation. He feared that his presence in England would perhaps be interpreted abroad as a sign, slender though it might appear, of an understanding between the staffs of the two countries. How over-scrupulous such conduct seems today. In the November of 1911, the Belgian government had forwarded to its minister in Berlin, Count Grindel, particulars of the measures to be taken in the event of a Franco-German war. My predecessor expressed the opinion that one of the prospects to be considered was the entry of British or French troops into Belgium. This was a very natural answer, as coming from an old diplomat who, after 50 years of exceptionally useful service to his country, had acquired not only a wide experience but a certain skepticism as regards the great powers. He held that they were all equally to be dreaded whenever the conflicting interests threatened the free existence of the smaller states. Such are the grievances, sifted and resifted 100 times over, which the German government has flaunted in order to vindicate itself and to make the civilized world believe that Belgium, by her secret agreements with England, had failed in her obligations as a neutral state. The cry of indignation that went up from Europe, and above all from the United States, over the invasion of our country, had aroused certain qualms in the Chancellor and his associates. How could this brutal aggression be justified, especially when the excesses of a frenzied soldiery made the crime still more heinous? Laborious researches into the archives of the Belgian government offices led to the discovery, among the staff's papers, of the Ducarne and Jungbluth reports, besides a copy of Count Grindel's, an unhoped-for treasure trove. The Norddeutsche Zeitung hastened to acquaint the public with his find, complaining at the same time that Belgium had made a military convention with England without informing Germany, and without proposing a similar pact to the latter power as a safeguard against a French or British attack. The organ of the Wilhelmstrasse, unable to supply any evidence of the convention, for the very good reason that it did not exist, took the liberty of garbling the Ducarne report by a mistranslation of one important word. In the phrase, "Our conversation is confidential," "Notre conversation est confidentielle," conversation is rendered Abkommen, which signifies agreement. Thanks to this fraud, the credulous German public, always ready to accept blindly anything that bears the government hallmark, had no further doubts as to Belgium's treachery. Teutonic legal experts proceeded to draw ponderous indictments of our unhappy country. It was not enough to plunder and destroy her. She had to be dishonored as well. Worst of all, the Chancellor actually declared to the Reichstag some months later that on the 4th of August he already possessed proofs of our government's treason against Germany before any written evidence came into his hands. Is it credible that, in his speech of 4th August, when any means of lightening his remorse must have been welcome, he should have said no word of his suspicions? Is it conceivable that Herr von Jagow, when I went to ask him for an explanation of the outrage done to Belgium, should not have cast in my teeth the famous proofs of our misdeeds, instead of admitting that our conduct had been unblemished? Once Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg had entered boldly on the track of falsehood in order to salvage the shipwrecked honor of his country, he soon made remarkable progress. He had the audacity to tell some American pressmen who had come to Berlin in order to find out the truth about the horrors of this war that after the first encounters, Belgian girls amused themselves by gouging out the eyes of wounded German soldiers. Note, statement made by the Chancellor on 6 November 1914 to the representatives of the great American agencies, United Press and Amalgamated Press, end note. Did he fully grasp the infamy of these unsupported charges? All the private honesty of the Hohenfinau philosopher will not atone for his public calumnies. There is no need to add that the British government never intended to violate Belgian neutrality by sending troops to our country, so long as this neutrality was respected by others. This point is brought out clearly in a dispatch, since published, which Sir Edward Grey wrote to the British minister at Brussels for the information of our Foreign Office. Segment 3. From the accession of King Albert to the invasion of our territory, Germany's attitude towards Belgium always seemed friendly. Nevertheless, in the various pronouncements that it had occasion to make concerning its respect for our neutrality, the imperial government set itself to lull our suspicions whenever we began to feel uneasy in spite of ourselves, without committing itself to assurances of a very formal nature. Germany had been one of the first to recognize the annexation of the Congo by Belgium. What better testimony of her goodwill could she give? Some may ask. It remains to be seen whether this alacrity was not part of a very deliberate purpose. The Congo, annexed to a weak state, would be a prey far easier to capture later on than if it had been added to the French Empire in Africa, on the strength of the preemptive right which King Leopold allowed France to retain. Furthermore, should there be a partition of the Free State, a very likely contingency, it was quite on the cards that Belgium and even France would be unwilling to saddle themselves with so heavy a burden. In that case, Germany might step in and manage to secure the choicest morsels. It was a clever stroke, therefore, to encourage the colonizing ardor of the Belgian people at the outset until the time came for damping it and for ending their activities in this direction. But Leopold II had left us, together with his African domain, a whole skein of difficulties to unravel in connection with the frontiers of the new colony. When the negotiations skillfully conducted at the opening of the new reign for the fixing of the boundary between the Congo and German East Africa were nearing their end, our young sovereign wished to give the emperor a token of his personal feelings and of his sincere wish to keep up good relations with Germany in Africa as well as in Europe. Together with the Queen, he paid him an official visit at the close of 1910. I was in their Majesty's suite. Their reception at Potsdam was very cordial and of an almost intimate character, apart from the 2 customary spring parades which our sovereigns attended and the military banquets that followed. Unfortunately, a slight illness of the emperor's robbed this visit of its chief attraction for spectators who, like myself, were eager to note the expression of the imperial mask. At the court dinner, the crown prince read the speech prepared by his father and bade the royal pair welcome. The most salient passages were those alluding to the wedded bliss that a princess of a German house had brought to our king, and recalling the ties of blood between the 2 families, besides the historical memories that linked the 2 countries. King Albert, in his reply, above all praised the emperor as a man of peace, who had devoted his life to securing the welfare of his subjects and the economic advance of Germany. It was thus under the aspect of a Solomon or a Titus that he then appeared to the unsuspecting Belgians, and the compliment, of which he must have been weary, was not, we thought, calculated to displease him. The German sovereigns did not wait until the following year before returning the visit. They came to Brussels at the end of October, accompanied by their youngest daughter. The presence of the young princess bore further witness to their genuine friendship with King Albert and Queen Elizabeth. William II, both in his official after-dinner speeches and his private conversations, declared himself deeply touched by the welcome that he had received. His heart warmed to the Belgian people, and he was delighted at their successes in the sphere of industry and commerce, as revealed in striking fashion at the Brussels International Exhibition. Jovial, affable, enthusiastic in turn, and constantly breaking into his guttural laugh, he ran up and down the whole gamut of his nature. His hearers were spellbound. How could they have failed to be convinced that the great emperor in their midst was a benevolent Titan? Obvious attempts to gain for Germany the favor of the Belgian court and society, amazement at our prosperity, such were the impressions left upon us by the mobile face and winning smile of our august visitor. Brussels, unused to receiving royal personages, had spared no effort in order to rise to the occasion. When the emperor, from the balcony of the town hall, had feasted his eyes on the incomparable scene of the marketplace, he exclaimed to the empress, "We did not expect anything so beautiful." While on his way back from a drive to Tervuren on the magnificent road constructed by the late king, he expressed his astonishment at the number of sumptuous villas along the way, and estimated the incomes of their owners. It is rash to parade one's wealth before a stranger, especially if that stranger happens to be a neighboring monarch, the head of an army of 5 million men. Belgium, which William II had not seen for 32 years, must have seemed to him a fair jewel, worthy to be added to his crown. The Grey Book, published by the Belgian government, contains a message from the Chancellor transmitted to our Foreign Office by the German minister in 1911. The Foreign Office had suggested, in the course of the controversy over the Dutch government's scheme for fortifying Flushing, a public pronouncement by the German government on the subject of Belgian neutrality. Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg stated that Germany had no intention of violating it, but that a public pronouncement would weaken her military position as regards France, who, if enlightened on this point, would concentrate all her forces on her eastern frontier. Thus, in 1911, the Chancellor, in order to avoid binding himself by a solemn promise, already sheltered himself behind the plea that it would be dangerous to divulge the plan of campaign. On the eve of the war, it will be remembered, Herr von Jagow gave a similar answer to Sir Edward Goschen when the latter sought to obtain from him a guarantee that our neutrality would be respected by the German troops. Very vague, too, was the language used by Herr von Kitterlin-Vector in 1912. Scarcely had I taken up my post in Berlin before he complained to me about the excitement shown in Belgium during the Agadir crisis. As a mere measure of precaution, we had put our fortresses into a state of defense. There was no reason, the Foreign Secretary observed to me, to fear that Germany would violate your neutrality or that of your Dutch neighbors. Fine words, but nothing more. A year later, on April 29, 1913, Herr von Jagow, urged by a socialist at a Reichstag committee to explain himself on the subject of Belgian neutrality, curtly replied that this question was determined by international agreements and that Germany would respect those agreements. He obstinately refused to say any more to another socialist member who was not satisfied with this summary answer. It is true that up to the last moment before the dispatch of the ultimatum, the German minister and military attaché at Brussels endeavored to tighten the bandage that they had been ordered to place round the eyes of the Belgian authorities. Even on the 2nd of August, both vouched for the friendly intentions of the imperial government, that government which now charges Belgium with duplicity and betrayal. German military writers, on the other hand, showed no such reticence. That irrepressible spokesman of the war party, General von Bernhardi, in his book which the world loves to quote, since it faithfully confesses the rapacious instincts of the officer caste, scornfully treats the lawyer's conception of permanent neutrality as a political heresy, and the protection that it affords as a bulwark of paper. With regard to Belgium, he hints that she might well be deemed to have already forfeited her neutral rights by her own act. How so, pray? Through clandestine treaties with Germany's foes? No, through becoming a colonial power. It may well be asked, says this Jesuitical soldier, whether the acquisition of the Congo was not ipso facto a breach of Belgian neutrality. For a neutral state, which, at any rate in theory, is secure from all risk of war, has no right to enter into political competition with other states. Bernhardi deliberately ignores the fact that these other states, Germany first of all, recognized the Belgian annexation of the Congo without any attempt to repudiate the treaties guaranteeing Belgian neutrality. Under the sway of these sophistries, however, the idea of a violation was gaining ground in the German intellectual world. When the imperial government passed from theory to practice, it met in Germany with a universal chorus of applause. Segment 4. The geographical position of Belgium, devoid as she is of natural frontiers, in itself compelled her to adopt measures of defense, to build fortresses and to maintain an efficient army. The checkered history of the past served to the Belgian people as a warning for the future. Her plains had been the favorite cockpit for the struggles between Bourbon and Habsburg, the theater of the first victories of the French Republic, and the grave of the Napoleonic Empire. By a miracle, our country was saved from all peril in 1870 through the sacrifice of a French army which chose to surrender at Sedan rather than seek refuge in neutral territory. The prospect of another war, which loomed large before us even during the most quiet hours of the last few decades, made it an imperative duty for our rulers to take far-reaching military precautions. A no less cogent reason was the upholding of our neutrality. A neutral state, if attacked, is bound to defend itself. It owes this to its guarantors in order to preserve that balance of interests which in their eyes is the motive that justifies its existence. In other words, a neutrality that cannot defend itself is nothing but a diplomatic fiction. Our various ministries, Catholic or liberal, have had this obligation impressed upon them, each in its turn. The progress of armaments, if the word progress can be applied to the monstrous development of these engines of destruction, has loaded the Belgians, in the same way as their neighbors, with an ever-growing mass of military burdens. A defensive system that seemed adequate in 1870 was no longer adequate 10 years later, owing to the increase in the number of combatants and the power and range of artillery, both in France and Germany. To Antwerp, a fortress and an entrenched camp, our only real stronghold, called by us the keep of our castle, must be added the forts of Liège and Namur, intended to block up the valley of the Meuse. Experts agreed in pointing to this as the natural route for an army seeking to pierce into France from Germany, or vice versa, without coming into collision with the defensive works erected on both sides of the Vosges. The forts with steel cupolas at Liège and Namur, devised by our great military engineer Brialmont, were for a time considered the most finished product of the art of fortification. After exhaustive debates lasting for 2 years, the Belgian Parliament resolved in 1906 to devote a sum of £2,520,000 to reconstructing the defenses of Antwerp, which were of an obsolete type. 15 new forts were built on both banks of the Scheldt, besides 12 redoubts, and the expenditure did not stop at the above estimate. The Belgian army remained until 1909 on a peace footing of 100,000 men. It was recruited both by voluntary methods and by a system of conscription which allowed the providing of substitutes, an antiquated and undemocratic principle. This figure was obviously too low for a serviceable field army and garrison force, two indispensable factors in our defense. Among the bulk of the population, however, feeling was opposed to the introduction of compulsory service. This was not due to a distaste for the profession of arms — the Belgian has always been a first-rate soldier — but from an aversion to barrack life and a dread of the promiscuities that it entails. Moreover, among many of our people, the belief in the inviolability granted to us by the 1839 treaties was still as firmly rooted as though it had been an article of faith. Their attention, as enterprising traders and manufacturers, did not go beyond the restricted area of their business. The political entanglements that succeeded each other from year to year could not shake their robust optimism, which looked upon military sacrifices as useless. Happily, the perils with which Belgium was beset did not escape the vigilant eye of our sovereigns. Leopold II was not only the brilliant creator of the Congo state, the prime mover in Belgium's economic expansion, an expansion that, relatively speaking, is no less noteworthy than that of the German nation, he was also a great patriot. As such, he never let slip any signal opportunity in public life of admonishing the Belgians to do all that was needed for the strengthening, first of their defensive resources and then of their field army. Fortunately, his appeals did not go unheard, and a considerable advance was made on the day that the Cholert cabinet passed the measure enacting that one son in every family must undergo military training, the first step towards a general system of compulsory service. When the Prime Minister brought the act to be signed, the old king was on his deathbed. With a failing hand, he wrote his name, then sank back into his last sleep, conscious of having fulfilled his duty to his country. His successor applied himself with the same patriotic zeal to carrying out the same task. He had already vowed to bring it to completion. There is no topic on which the native eloquence of King Albert was heard to better advantage than that of making the army fit to meet the responsibilities that it would one day incur. The events of 1911 and 1912 showed, even to those who had tried the hardest to shut their eyes, how unerring was the insight of our sovereign. Many statesmen whose brains had been clouded by the visions of a too lofty idealism now saw the error of their ways and realized that the abolition of war was as yet an idle dream. The bill introducing universal service was passed in May 1913. Monsieur de Broqueville, who had supported it with consummate skill before the Chamber, had the notable honor of inscribing his name underneath the King's own on one of the most striking pages of Belgium's internal history. It was thus 15 months before the German invasion that this much-needed law secured a majority of votes in the Belgian parliament. It stands to reason that, if we had wanted to sign a secret pact with England and France some years earlier, their governments would have insisted, before all things, on the strengthening of our inadequate army. The new bill was to furnish an annual contingent of from 33,000 to 35,000 men, and we could look forward to a total of 340,000 combatants, excluding a variable number of volunteers, as soon as the system was in full working order. The anticipated effectives, however, would not be obtained until 1925. In 1914, at the moment of taking the field, the Belgian army had some 226,000 men, together with 4,500 officers and 4,170 military police, wherewith to stem the tide of invasion. The introduction of universal service in Belgium was not looked upon with favor in Germany. As a matter of fact, the emperor ought to have been delighted. During his visit to Switzerland in the previous autumn, he had complained of the exposed state of his northwestern frontier, as contrasted with the solid rampart provided in the south by the excellent troops of the Swiss Confederation. The German newspapers spoke of our military reforms without any malicious comments, but the same cannot be said of the German officer class. I was able to gather this from the remarks made to me by Baron von Zedlitz, colonel of a dragoon regiment of the Guards, and grandson, on his mother's side, of a former Belgian minister at Berlin. No doubt the Belgian sympathies that he had inherited from his mother moved him to embosom himself to me one day. "What is the good," he said, "of enlarging the number of your troops? With the small number that you had before, you surely never dreamt of barring the way to us in a Franco-German war. The increase of your effectives might inspire you with the idea of resisting us. If a single shot were fired on us, heaven knows what would become of Belgium." This was the language of a friend, but not of a soldier. I answered the colonel that we should be rated still lower than at present if we were craven enough not to defend ourselves, and that our guns would be ready to meet the invader, whoever he might be. I had occasion to repeat this phrase several times to other Germans. They listened with smiles, but they did not believe me. End of section 16. Section 17 of Germany Before the War by Baron Eugene Napoleon Beyens, translated by Paul V. Cohn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Lienhart. Chapter 9, Belgian Neutrality and the Invasion of Belgium, Part 2. Segment 5. The passage of the belligerents through Belgium was a favorite theme with all writers, French, German, English, Dutch, and Belgian, who handled more or less competently the problem of the coming war. Some of Germany's preparations for invading her neighbors could not be hidden, and these naturally gave a fillip to the discussion of various moot points. As early as 1911, 10 railway lines, both single and double, ran from the Eifel region to the Belgian frontier or the Duchy of Luxembourg. 4 others were under construction, and yet another 4 were projected. Most of these lines were quite needless for purposes of traffic, and their aim was purely strategic. Stations with full plant and special platforms for the arrival and departure of troops had been built with that methodical thoroughness for which the Germans are famous. An enormous concentration camp with a range for artillery practice had been established at Elsenborn near Malmedy, a stone's throw from our frontier. Which route would be chosen by the oncoming host? Some critics pronounced for the passage by the Gap of the Meuse along both banks of that river. As the German army had the advantage of a more speedy mobilization, it was generally credited with the design of taking the offensive in this region of Belgian territory. So far, we had no cause for doubting that our fortresses were impregnable, still less that they were capable of resisting. The progress of ballistics in Germany and Austria, the terrible results gained by unremitting toil in the workshops of Krupp and Skoda, were still unknown to the outside world. No one suspected the existence of German 17-inch and Austrian 12-inch mortars, which would shatter a fort of concrete and steel in a few hours under a fire of projectiles weighing nearly a ton. Other writers limited the German march to the right bank of the Meuse across Belgian Luxembourg despite the scarcity of roads and the obstacles that the broken nature of the country would offer to a rapid onset. Luxembourg, an outlying spur of our territory in the Ardennes district, seemed impossible for the Belgian force to defend. The force in question would have been too far distant from the base of operations. Some military prophets, such as General Desjardins in Belgium and General Métaux in France, made a very shrewd conjecture. They held that the enemy would operate mainly in great masses on the left bank of the Meuse, where he would have ample room for deploying. In point of fact, however, the plan of the German staff had not been fathomed in all its bearings. Among those who could speak with authority, the greater number imagined that only a part, the right wing of the army directed against France, would pass through Belgium. They had not guessed the bold maneuver, the tremendous developments that we have seen carried out. To leave a curtain of troops along the Vosges line, and with 3/4 of the army to cross the Meuse at several points, from Visé right down to Dinant, to take Liège and Namur by storm if necessary, to march on Brussels, sweeping aside the Belgian army if it should try to withstand the advance, and from there to turn off southwards by the various routes that lead to Paris. The whole northwestern section of France was unprovided with defenses, excepting the fortress of Maubeuge. Once the plains of Belgium had been traversed, the road to Paris would be open. The reader must picture to himself not a stream or a torrent, but a veritable sea of men inundating our country from Holland to Luxembourg, 1.5 million to 2 million soldiers. The defensive plans of Germany's opponents had not allowed for the inrush of such an avalanche through Belgium. At the outset of the war, according to an official note issued by the Republican government, the whole of the French forces were disposed over against the German border, from Belfort to the Belgian frontier. The first condition of success for so daring an offensive was secrecy. The secret was well kept. The High German command did all it could to throw foreign military attachés off the trail and to encourage them in false notions. Among their various methods of hoodwinking the stranger, we may probably include the way in which the permanent stations of the 25 Army Corps were distributed. The map showed us 10 of them massed together in Alsace-Lorraine, the Palatinate and the Grand Duchy of Baden, as if ready to hurl themselves on France from that quarter. Along the Belgian and Dutch frontiers, only one corps was stationed, and its command lived a long way off at Koblenz. With so meager a contingent, the chances of an attempt to enter Belgium seemed remote indeed. Yet the corps of Westphalia, of Hanover, of Holstein even, could be brought up to the western frontier in a very short time by the numerous railway lines. It was the two former, with that of Koblenz, that crossed the Meuse and attacked Liège under General von Emisch, commandant at Hanover, a leader of high repute. Assuredly, the staff did not await the order for a general mobilization before concentrating this vanguard at Cologne and Aix-la-Chapelle. Segment 6. From the first days of the Austro-Serbian dispute, the Belgian government was on the watch. It did not shrink from taking the precautionary steps required in a country that nature has left unsheltered. On 29th July, the Belgian army was put on the maximum peace footing. 2 days later, there was a general mobilization, and 180,000 men were called to the colors. Thanks to these prompt measures, the storm did not take us off our guard, although it came at such short notice. The Brussels cabinet, however, did not know, any more than I did, of the bargaining which the German government had attempted during the last days of the crisis in order to wrest from England a promise that she would remain neutral. First, it was France's turn to be chaffered over. Then came Belgium. Herr von Bethmann-Hollweg, in his interview of 29th July with Sir Edward Goschen, had confined himself to stating that our country would suffer no loss of territory, provided it did not take sides against Germany. He gave no guarantee as to our independence. This engagement would be enough, he fancied, to make the English, who were reluctant to face the hazards of a continental war, maintain the role of impartial onlookers, since they would not have to fear either the dismemberment of France or the disappearance of the little Belgian kingdom. Nevertheless, on the morning of 4th August, when the Chancellor learnt that Belgium was girding herself for a vigorous resistance, he grasped the necessity for calming London's excitement by a notable advance on his former bid. He telegraphed to the German ambassador, ordering him to tell Sir Edward Grey as soon as possible that under no pretense whatever would Germany annex Belgian territory. On the afternoon of the same day, growing uneasy at England's silence, he repeated to the Reichstag, with an addition, the guarantee he had proffered to Sir Edward Grey. Quote, "So long as Great Britain remains neutral, we shall respect the integrity and independence of Belgium." End quote. It was too late. An irretrievable blunder had been committed on the evening of 2nd August, namely the dispatch of a highly confidential note, the most brutal of ultimatums, to the Belgian foreign minister. Not a word was said in this document of the 1839 treaties or of Belgian neutrality, beyond a vague hint that France was about to make use of Belgian territory in her advance against Germany, a proceeding that compelled the latter to come to our aid. Then various baits are held out to Belgium if she will desert her trust as a neutral. By a diplomatic euphemism, the cowardly act demanded of her is cloaked under the name of benevolent neutrality. The integrity and independence of the kingdom will be respected to the full. Nothing is said explicitly about the Congo. Her territory will be evacuated after the conclusion of peace. The German troops will pay cash down for all that they require, and an indemnity will be granted for any damage that they may cause. The sting is in the tail. The threats are reserved for the end. If any armed resistance is offered, if any obstacles are placed in the way of the German march, if any roads, railways, or works of art are destroyed, Belgium will be treated as an enemy. This one word is enough to reveal the doom that will be meted out to her. These offers and menaces, following on the shock of the ultimatum, were cunningly devised to tame our spirits still further. All had been thought out. The suddenness of the blow, after the plausible assurances of the German minister at Brussels had quieted old tremors, the interval of only 12 hours for a reply, nay, the very moment chosen for sending the note, 7 o'clock in the evening, night that brings reflection, night with its unnerving darkness, would no doubt work upon the minds of the hapless victims, forced to choose between suicide and dishonor. Yet the German calculations were foiled. At the King's Council, hastily summoned to the royal palace, There was no sign of giving way. The ministers present, from within and without the cabinet, had shown all due regard for our eastern neighbor, and till then had firmly believed in the honesty of his intentions. The more cruel their disillusion, the more bitter their wrath must have been against the trickster who could lightly break the most solemn pledges. The king, with an unflinching resolve to do his full duty, first called upon the military members to set forth all the possibilities of defense. They were to speak the plain truth, without minimizing the fearful odds that our army had to face. When the staff had told its tale, the same thrill of heroism swept the whole council off its feet, even as on the next day it was to seize the whole parliament and nation. Before the meeting dispersed, the reply to the German note, of which a rough draft had already been made out by the Foreign Office, was drawn up and approved. On the following day, before the interval had expired, it was handed to the German minister. That was all. The absorbing drama, played within the space of a few brief hours, was over. The style of the royal government's answer, which no Belgian can read without tears of patriotic pride, is as noble and dignified, I cannot think that anyone will refute this, as that of the German document is false and constrained. In a few words, it brushes aside the pretext fabricated by the Berlin cabinet. It scorns to utter any useless complaint. It tries no subterfuge, no diplomatic shift that may leave it a loophole for revoking its words. It goes straight to the point. After declaring Belgium's unswerving loyalty to her international obligations in the past, it proudly announces that her government has chosen, without faltering for a moment, the path of duty and honor. Quote, "The Belgian government, by accepting the proposals put before it, would not only sacrifice its own honor, but would betray its duty towards Europe. It is determined to repel any assault upon its rights by every means in its power." End quote. What will King Albert do? He knows Germany too well not to feel certain that the rejection of her demands will be followed by an instant swoop of our formidable army. 3 days before, our sovereign had written a personal letter to William II. Since the emperor had professed to be his friend, he took the liberty of asserting Belgium's right to see her neutrality respected. This appeal failed to move the stony heart of the Kaiser. On 3rd August, King Albert turned to the King of England. He telegraphed to him, not to utter an urgent call for his military support, as might have been expected, with the storm drawing nearer every moment, but to ask for his diplomatic intervention. Is not this a conclusive proof that Belgium had not sought by any secret alliance to screen herself in England's arms from the attacks of the German Colossus? The envoy of the French Republic, who was fully posted up in the course of events, hastened of his own accord to offer French aid. Our foreign minister answered with thanks, but refused all succor for the time being. The Belgian government, he said, would consider later on what should be done in the matter. Not till the evening of the next day, when every fleeting hour was of crucial importance, and after he had learnt of the invaders' entry into Belgium that morning, not till the deed was done did he apply with admirable coolness to England, France, and Russia for help in the defense of our territory. Such scrupulous adherence to the hard and fast rules laid down in treaties, such faithfulness to a plighted oath when in the very jaws of death, would surely be hard to parallel. Segment 7. I learnt on 2nd August from our military attaché, who had the news from an officer of the Emperor's household, that the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg had been occupied. The route followed by the German army left me no doubt as to the coming invasion of Belgian Luxembourg, and I telegraphed this pessimistic forecast to my government. Yet I had not gauged the full measure of the disaster that was about to overtake my country. It was on the evening of Monday, 3rd August, that I received the official telegram informing me of the German ultimatum and of our reply. At first I was dumbfounded. Then came a fierce glow of indignation. I tried my utmost to betray no sign of this to my young secretaries, in order that their sorrow and their anger might not be needlessly increased. After urging them to be calm and collected, I spent a part of the night in reflecting on the questions that I would put to the Foreign Secretary at the earliest opportunity. I felt it my bounden duty to go to him and insist upon a downright explanation of the nameless act perpetrated by the German government. The readiness with which Herr von Jago let me know that he hoped to see me at the Foreign Office on Tuesday morning proved that he was no less impatient than I to have this decisive interview. When I arrived at 9 o'clock, the old building was still almost empty, but the Foreign Secretary was already at work in his room. I will not give here a full report of our conversation. It has already been published in that crushing indictment of Germany by my fellow countryman, Monsieur Maxweiler, La Belgique neutre et loyale. Before many words had passed between us, I saw that we were speaking two different languages, and that neither could understand the other's tongue. I invoked Belgium's honor, the honor that is no less sacred to a nation than to an individual, her obligations as a neutral, her past conduct, always thoroughly loyal towards Germany. This the Secretary of State ungrudgingly admitted, and her inability to answer the imperial government's proposal in any other way than she had answered it already. He could not help acknowledging this, but he did so with an effort for the most part, and merely in his private capacity, refusing, by a subtle distinction, to compromise himself as an official. He replied with cynical arguments, which seemed to him unimpeachable, that it was a question of life and death to Germany, that she was compelled to advance through Belgium in order to overpower France as speedily as possible, that the French frontier south of Belgium, with its chain of strong fortresses, was difficult to pierce. He repeated the Chancellor's guarantee that my country's independence would be respected and that an indemnity would be paid her. I fancy that he was reciting, word for word, a lesson drilled into him by the Chief of Staff. To these strategic reasons and these alluring promises, he added an expression of regret on behalf of himself, his emperor, and his government that they should have been driven to this extremity. When I announced my intention of leaving Berlin and of demanding my passports, he remonstrated. He did not want to break off relations with me. What had he expected from this interview, and what did he expect now? As I withdrew, I shot the Parthian arrow that I had kept in reserve. The violation of Belgian neutrality would mean for Germany a war with England. Herr von Jago had been speaking with emotion in an earnest tone, which he tried to make persuasive. But at this he merely shrugged his shoulders. My shaft, Tellum imbel scenic tu, was blunted by my opponent's armor of resolution or indifference. During the afternoon, the Emperor's speech in the Reichstag exhorted the nation's delegates to help in carrying to a triumphant issue this war that had been forced upon Germany. William II said nothing about the violation of Belgium, but called down upon his arms the blessing of the Most High, his wonted confidant. The next speaker was the Chancellor. More honest than he has been since then, he unhesitatingly confessed the wrong that had been done to Belgium and promised to make amends so soon as the military aim should have been attained. I had not been at fault, however, in predicting to Herr von Jago a war with England, one of the guarantors of our neutrality. That same evening I dined alone at the Kaiserhof, a prey, as may be imagined, to the gloomiest forebodings. As I left the restaurant, a handful of papers was flung to me from a Berliner Tageblatt motor car. Marveling at the swift fulfillment of my prophecy, I read that Great Britain had declared war on Germany, and that her ambassador, a few hours earlier, had handed in an ultimatum to the imperial government. I at once bethought myself of rushing to the British Embassy in order to obtain some further details of this wonderful news. Was it thus that heaven answered the appeals of her favorite? Round about that part of the Wilhelmstrasse in which the British Embassy is situated, a large crowd had foregathered. Respectably dressed citizens of both sexes were bellowing out, with frantic enthusiasm, their best-loved hymn, Deutschland über alles. The national anthem was succeeded by a volley of catcalls, after which came a shower of missiles, brickbats and lumps of coal, for no stones are to be found in the asphalt roadways of Berlin. The ground floor windows of the embassy were shivered to atoms, the two policemen posted on either side of the door making no attempt to interfere. I had seen and heard enough. As I was wending my way homewards, a gleam of hope stole into my heart amid all its grief and anguish. I saw a terrible face rising above the blood-red horizon, the face of the British nemesis. Segment 8. The invasion of Belgium was a blunder, both political and military. Political, because England, who no doubt would inevitably have come to take her stand by France, but not at the very opening of hostilities, was moved forthwith to intervene. Military, because the heroic and unexpected resistance of the Belgian army frustrated the rapid march on Paris. In other words, wrecked the initial plan of the German staff. The imperial government did not anticipate that we should show fight. Our hearts would fail us, they thought, at the mere approach of that redoubtable monster, the gigantic German army. A proof of this is the first attack on Liège. It was made by 3 corps without a siege train for reducing the forts. They imagined that every gate would open before them, that they would enter with banners flying and drums beating, and be received as conquering heroes, almost as friends. As soon as this illusion was dispelled, the Germans hastened to attack the forts. They tried to take them by storm and left 36,000 dead on the field. When Liège was at last captured, they lost 10 days in getting into proper trim again before they resumed their forward march, this time fully provided with artillery. This forced respite affected the first issue of the campaign. The staff, without taking the Belgian army into account, had mapped out beforehand all the opening stages, Liège, Namur, Mons, Charleroi, and so on, down to the Kaiser's entry into Paris. If our opponents went so far astray in their estimate of our fighting spirit, they must lay the blame on their diplomats and their military attachés, their journalists and their spies. The last German ministers at Brussels had certainly been of the same school as Herr von Jagow. They took no interest in the psychology of the Belgian people, and their contempt for the little country where they were received with open arms was only equaled, I should say, by their eagerness to leave its capital as soon as possible, since in their ambition they looked upon it as the mere stepping stone to an embassy. But what of their military attachés? Could they see in our soldiers nothing but marionettes of the parade ground, and in our officers nothing but champion riders at army competitions? Stranger still was the lack of insight shown by the correspondents of German newspapers. They carefully noted the most trivial details of our public life, but their judgment of us was blinded by prejudice and by the arrogance of a great nation which itself has only achieved unity at a recent date. They regarded Belgium as a mere geographical expression, the home of 2 hostile races, yoked together in spite of themselves and determined never to fuse. The quarrels of Flemings and Walloons were depicted in their articles as the outcome of an implacable hatred, and the conflict of political parties as a war to the knife, for they only wished to see how far Germany could make capital out of this cleavage. But the love that all Belgians have for their freedom escaped the notice of these observers settled in our midst. They carefully dissected our national body without discovering the national soul. Never had the Belgians seemed more divided than in the period preceding the war. Never were they in reality more united in a like devotion to their common country. What should we have gained by yielding to the German threats? What confidence could we have in the promises of a government that shamelessly tore up a solemn treaty in order to gain easier access to the country of its foe? Had the Germans come into Belgium as friends and won the war, they would never have left our land after their victory. If anyone is inclined to question this, let him consider the outburst of greed aroused in Germany by the invasion of Belgium. Intellectuals equipped with sham historical claims, manufacturers envious of our industrial successes, traders lusting to capture our markets, join hands today with the socialists who are no less infatuated than they with the ideal of a greater Germany, in order to demand our annexation. The Berlin cabinet would have resolved to break its word once more, and pretexts would not have been wanting. The need of seizing the whole North Sea coast as a naval base against England, the strategical and commercial importance of Antwerp, Perhaps, too, the inevitable wrangles between the Belgian authorities and the German officials who would have presided over the occupation of a part of the country. To what lengths, by the way, would this occupation not have gone? On what nook or corner of our soil should we still have been allowed to plant our national flag? Perhaps, this is the best we could have hoped for, the Germans would have asked us, in a wheedling tone, yet leaving no room for refusal, to become members of the Germanic Confederation. At first a customs union, a Zollverein, before complete incorporation, the right of admission to the Holy Empire had been decreed by our future Caesar on the advice of the Federal Council and in accordance with the progress of our Germanization. They would not have waited for this glorious day in order to control and regulate the output of our factories and our coal mines, affiliating the workers to the German trade unions, to organize the activities of Antwerp without injuring those of the German ports, and to restrict its commercial hinterland, to watch over our daily life, prohibit all displays of national feeling, instill German discipline into our army, and make our statesmen and our diplomats their submissive thralls. We should have been at once relieved of the Congo, too heavy a burden for our shoulders. We should have been compelled to learn German as a third language, soon to become the official tongue. Many a time, while reading in our newspapers the wretched controversies caused by the rivalry between our two languages, I have had occasion to say to the young men on my staff, they don't seem to realize in Belgium the danger of our seeing German one day become the language of instruction at Ghent University. If we had become attached to their empire in this way, a process that every German would have regarded as an honor for us, the reward of our friendly neutrality, the outward form of our government would have run little risk of being changed. William II, following the example of Bismarck, is not the man to overturn a throne without good reason. He will always prefer to bind other princes to himself by the strong chains of vassalage. The same doom awaited Holland, although Herr von Jägel, shortly before the German ultimatum was sent to Brussels, had taken care to assure the Dutch minister that the neutrality of his country would be respected. Was not Holland in the Middle Ages one of the jewels of the Germanic imperial crown? With her shores washed by the North Sea and the estuary of the Rhine flowing through her midst, did she not command the course of Germany's greatest river? According to the view of the Chancellor, as set forth in his telegram of 4th August to Prince Lichnowsky, would not an annexation of Belgium by force or guile involve similar treatment of the Orange Kingdom? The conversation in which Herr Zimmermann clumsily dangled before the eyes of the Dutch socialist Telstra an invitation to Holland to enter the Zollverein after the war gave our Dutch friends a glimpse of Germany's designs on their country. The King of Bavaria took it upon himself to give them another glimpse when he declared, with the blunt frankness of a peasant from his own highlands, that the Germans needed the whole course of the Rhine down to the sea. This would imply occupying the mouth of the Meuse and the estuary of the Scheldt. Denmark, again, possesses one of the keys to the Baltic. Can she forget, after the bitter experience she has had, the voracious appetite of her dread neighbor? This picture, by no means overdrawn, of the blessings in store for us after a German triumph must prove to my fellow citizens that, in order to escape them, our king and government took the only path open to them in an agonizing Calvary, the path of honor. There was nothing for it but to defend our freedom, sword in hand, at the price of the nation's best blood, a freedom that the Germans, after defeating France, would have withheld from us all the more scornfully if we had been weak enough to listen to them and cowardly enough to obey them. End of section 17. Section 18 of Germany Before the War by Baron-Eugène Napoleon Beyens, translated by Paul V. Cohn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Lienhart. Conclusion. A sovereign, coming at an early age to the most conspicuous throne in Europe, already too sure of his own talents, fretting with impatience to rule without restraint or guardianship, pacific both by instinct and by reason, but of a helmeted and mail-clad pacifism, which loved to vent itself in needless threats. The same prince, 25 years later, puffed up with pride over the marvelous expansion of his country, in which he had certainly borne his share by keeping the peace, but gradually won over to the schemes of conquest and of domination whispered into his ear. Ill-informed, for want of accurate reports and of personal discernment as to the state of public feeling among his neighbors and as to their capacity for resistance, ready, without any qualms, to seize the first opportunity of starting a war in which victory seemed to him certain and the risks hardly worth counting. The responsible author, since he wields a despotic sway, of all the horrors and disasters around us, bred by the relentless militarism and the boundless ambition of a dynasty that deems itself called upon to govern the world. A royal family, void of prestige or distinction, obscured by the shadow that the dazzling personality of the emperor cast behind it, although one figure strove hard to emerge from the darkness, the restless, carping, bellicose crown prince, federal rulers enjoying a mere puppet sovereignty and acquiescing in their subaltern role from fear of vanishing altogether from the German stage, a stage now too narrow to let them stand by the side of their Caesar. Statesmen as powerless to make their counsels prevail as to defend the imperial policy, over which, perhaps, their conscience smote them at times. A Reichstag split up into too many groups and parties, and divided on all questions save that of the timeliness of this war, the conservatives hoping thereby to strengthen their influence, and the socialists expecting to gain, as the price of their zealous support, those political liberties that they were unable to win by main force. A disciplined, credulous, and hard-working nation, concerned above all with earning its daily bread, pacific for the most part, or rather indifferent to foreign affairs, until the day when, on the strength of official assurances, it believed itself to be attacked, and in peril of losing its work, its national honor, its very existence. A lying vision, yet hard to banish from its gaze, an erroneous belief which will drive it until the bitter end to face the most dire suffering and to endure the most cruel sacrifices. The future will teach us whether it will not demand later on a heavy reckoning from those who have played it false. A minority drawn from the intellectual and governing castes, dreaming of victory and aggrandizement, with a passionate desire to see the colossal fabric of German supremacy towering to the heavens, steeped in a limitless hatred or disdain for those who have not the honor to be Germans. From the very opening of hostilities, the morbid conceit of the scholars and men of science was unveiled in clear outlines through those amazing manifestos on the rights that the superior science, organization, strength, and culture of Germany empower her to claim. In my opinion, however, it would be a mistake to look upon this select band as typical of the nation, just as it would be wrong to make all Germany answerable for the misdeeds of her brutal soldiery and for the frightful war waged by the military and naval chiefs. Disheartening rebuffs to German and Austro-Hungarian diplomacy both in Morocco and the Near East, where, despite all the efforts of Berlin and Vienna, there arose a state of things inimical to the spread, nay, even to the prestige of Germanism. As a result of these checks, a vast increase of military preparations, while at the same time the war parties in Germany, and in Austria-Hungary too, raged and clamored more than ever, warning symptoms to which public opinion abroad, misled by the peaceful solution of the previous crisis, paid but a half-hearted attention. All these causes, individual or collective, whirling us abruptly, on the morrow of a murder that a little police precaution would have averted, to the brink of an abyss in which the freedom of Europe has come near to being engulfed forever. Such is the complicated picture that I have tried to sketch, with as a background the crimes committed against Belgium and Serbia. I hope that I may be pardoned for closing this book with a few words on the subject of my gallant country. Civilization is not a unique, exotic plant, the product of culture, of a chosen people, but a cluster of varied flowers grown on varied soils, and the most modest of them are not the least hardy nor the least beautiful. From the standpoint of human progress, the existence of small states, contributing to that progress, has justified itself as essential to the needs of mankind. Some have been fruitful fields for experiment in the introducing or the improving of various social or political systems. Others have outstripped nations far larger than themselves in the universal realm of literature and the fine arts. Others on the broad path of industrial competition. In these and other domains, how many deathless glories can one of them show on the long and illustrious scroll of its history? The political necessity for the existence of small states as factors of peace is no less imperative. It has sometimes been their lot, by virtue of their situation at the mouths of rivers, on the shores of seas, or at the intersection of mountain ranges, to restrain the clashing and the jarring of the quarrelsome great powers. They have thus served as watertight compartments or solid buffers, if these technical terms are worthy to express the services rendered by them in maintaining the harmony of Europe. The war party and the Prussian military writers, with their imperialist doctrines, will not hear today of the European balance. To them it is an outworn shibboleth, a mere historical relic. Yet one of the great lessons to be learnt from a study of the past is that this balance remains permanent and indestructible in a continent peopled by rival races. In the end, it has always come to be restored on the ruins of mighty empires, after the shocks and oscillations that it has suffered from the ambitions of conquerors. At the beginning of the last 2 centuries, the map of Europe, a shifting mosaic, was fixed anew by a sort of historical process, and the small states were not the least useful materials that went to the working of this transformation. As a matter of fact, Belgium is one of the oldest among these states, for she may fairly trace her career back to the days of the Duke of Burgundy, to the reign of Philip the Good, who succeeded in reuniting the Belgian provinces of the Netherlands. For 4 centuries, apart from an interval of 20 years, during which these provinces were attached to France and received from her their laws and their administrative divisions, their Walloon and Flemish inhabitants lived side by side under the same foreign rulers. They did not blend, it is true. Each element was careful to retain its distinctive language and character, but they professed the same creed, kept up brotherly relations, and enjoyed similar liberties, more happy and more free in their thriving cities and medieval communes than many a more ambitious nation. From the time that Belgium acquired a dynasty of her own and took her seat among the nations, wrapped in her neutrality as in a robe of spotless white, she made remarkable headway in almost every branch of human activity. The little people of a few million souls occupied before the war the 5th place in the list of commercial and industrial countries, standing above Austria-Hungary with its 50 million inhabitants. King Leopold did not overrate either the energy or the spirit of enterprise inherent in his subjects when he opened up and finally handed over to them the vast basin of his great African river. What a splendid prospect of work and endeavor was offered to them in Africa as in Europe. What a noble future for an industrious life, deserving the respect of the whole civilized world. Yet there was one thing lacking to Belgium. She had not been purified by sorrow or hallowed by suffering. This crown of thorns was at last thrust upon her head by the cruelty of the Germans. Then the little nation was seen to stiffen under its martyrdom, without abandoning the struggle to live and to resist. The shining example of heroism came to it from above, from its young royal pair, to whom it was devoted, and in whom it centered its fondest hopes. 10 months have passed, and King Albert still remains planted, firmly as an oak, in the last shred of territory, facing the enemy, whose strength is powerless to bend or to break him. Around him is his young army, sadly thinned by unequal struggles, but galvanized into new life, having repaired its losses by an accession of fresh blood, certain of victory, for it knows that the very heart of its country is throbbing beneath the folds of its flag. Not far off is the government, which would not yield up the honor of Belgium at the German bidding, and which labors busily in its exile, in order to relieve our refugees, to maintain the public services, and to act as intermediary for the generous and sympathetic aid tendered from foreign sources. If Europe turns aside from the sight of this indomitable resistance and looks at our country, what does she see there? The head of the Belgian clergy, the very incarnation of civic patriotism and priestly virtues, stimulating his flock to courage and endurance, caring naught for coercion or threats, and awaiting with full trust in the divine judge the day when in his church, not spared, alas, by the invader, he shall celebrate the Te Deum of our deliverance. Everywhere she sees devotion to the fatherland and to Christian solidarity. She sees the burgomaster of Brussels, whose brave voice could only be silenced by imprisonment, although even now his memory and his example still hover, as an ever-present encouragement above his fellow citizens and his city. She sees men who yesterday were rich, heads of banks that today are closed and of workshops that today are empty, joining with the intellectual flower of Brussels citizens to provide for the poor, to ensure that the people shall not die of hunger and privation. She sees women of all sorts and conditions turned into sisters of charity. She sees fathers and mothers stricken to the heart by the death of their sons or anxious as to their fate, living often in homes that the enemy has rifled, yet with calm, tearless eyes and faces ennobled by sacrifice. And last of all, she sees, behind the classes that once were privileged, the admirable crowd, the army of humble toilers, stoically enduring their forced loss of work or their inability to help their country, watching in grim silence the countless dead and wounded brought in from the enemy regiments, who do not cease to die with their blood, that Belgian soil where they thought they had only to appear in order to conquer. No, such a people cannot die. The Belgian soul, whose existence some dared to deny, has gained a new temper from the flame of battle, and it still lives today, more vigorous than ever, to realize our national motto, Union makes strength. But Belgium is not yet at the end of her long ordeal, at the limit of her travail, or on the eve of drying her tears. The iron monster of German militarism cannot be battered down in a day. I have seen him at too close quarters preparing and arming for the fray to have any delusions on that score. The league of his adversaries has swollen in number and grown in power, but at present this only whets his rage, and thus for the time being his might, like that of a man who suddenly goes mad, is redoubled. Germany is not yet near to waking up with a start from her tragic dream of triumph and domination. The day of liberation is slow to dawn for us, and we still have a long agony to go through. But let no Belgian, whether he has been forced to take the road of exile or is suffering, with no word of complaint, the well-nigh intolerable contact with the oppressor, let no Belgian become for a single instant a prey to discouragement or despair. The hour will strike without fail from the belfries of our town halls and the steeples of our churches, the hour when our country, reconquered and 10 times more dear, will press to her lacerated bosom all her sons, once more united in an equal love for their common mother, the hour when Belgium will recover her place among the nations, a loftier place than ever, owing to her valor in the combat and her steadfastness in adversity. End of section 18. Section 19 of Germany Before the War by Baron-Eugène Napoleon-Beyens, translated by Paul V. Cohn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Appendix. With regard to the view expressed in Chapter 5 concerning the subordinate part played by the economic causes of the war, it has been pointed out to me that during the Agadir crisis, the employers of labor in the various German metal industries, grouped under the name of Steel Syndicate, addressed a petition to the Chancellor asking that war should be declared on France. Other industrial and economic leagues suggested to him, in special memorials, annexations in Belgium, France, and Russia. Because the German ironmasters, egged on perhaps by Krupp and the army contractors, and suffering on the other hand from a spell of reckless overproduction, were hunting for fresh markets, even at the price of a costly and bloody struggle, and because other manufacturers embraced similar schemes of conquest, it does not follow, first, that the majority of employers, great and small, who wanted to work in peace became advocates of war. Secondly, this point I have tried to prove in the aforesaid chapter, that such a war would have obtained for Germany the new markets that she hankered after. Nor does it follow that the imperial government let itself be led or dragged into the war by the manufacturers. Its opinions, I am ready to admit, coincided with those of many among this class, as also with those of the agrarian section. But in declaring war on France and Russia, it pursued above all a political aim. It did not take up arms with the main object of securing for Germany an economic monopoly or hegemony in Europe. Today, for instance, when we see the Germans endeavoring to change into an annexation their occupation of Belgium and northwestern France, we see that it is the possession of the North Sea coast and the Strait of Dover that they mainly have in view, in order from there to be able to strike a deadly blow at the British power. The results of a German victory were admirably defined by Monsieur Poincaré in his fine speech of 14th July. Quote, "We should fall forever into a political, moral, and economic thraldom," end quote. The economic vassalage would only be a consequence of the political thraldom. End of section 19. End of Germany Before the War by Baron Eugene Napoleon Beyens, translated by Paul V. Cohn.